I am the elected chairperson of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, who are the cultural authority under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act for the land that I am on. I would like to pay my respects to all elders past and present, to you and the nations of land that you are on today. It is always a humbling privilege to provide a welcome to country, and our practices are varied across the lands and our waterways. A welcome isn't just words, it is a reflection of where we are. Not our modern day places, but the continuous link of life, lessons, purpose, and nurturing supplies. I am on the lands of the Eora Nation. The boundaries of our traditional owners are embedded into the Earth's natural landscapes. The boundaries of the Eora are the Hawkes River in the north, the Nepean in the west, and the Georges River in the south. Wherever you travel across this beautiful continent of ours, understand you're entering the lands of nations, tribes, and clans existing here for over 60,000 years. The First Nations of this country are the oldest living culture of the world. And on behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, the elders, and the members, I welcome everyone to the land of the Gadigal. I acknowledge the Gadigal people and also the people of lands that you're on today. His spirits and ancestors will always remain with these lands and Mother Earth. As we're all gathered, let us remember the many warriors that created pathways for all of us, the ones recognised and those we've never heard of. My people's stories aren't myths. They are this land's history that has been passed on from one generation to the next. There have been many lessons learned at our expense and our devastation. They should and must be acknowledged, not out of a guilt, but to listen, learn, and to come together. My people had our land taken from us and we were put into homes. Then we had our homes taken only to go back to the land where our connections were removed or destroyed. The dispossession can continue in the disconnect, and this is for all of us. So as you connect, learn, and share today, tomorrow, and beyond, continue to make a difference, but don't lose sight of the important work that still needs to be done. And we all need to work together to stop the isolation from the security of our homes, from the affordability of access to housing, and stop the isolation from each other, creating a society we can be proud of. All of us together can bring about positive changes now and into the future. To make that future possible, let us all draw upon my people's spirits as we continue on our journey. May my people's spirits walk with you and guide you as we strive forward for us all. Again, on behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, welcome to Gadigal land. This always was, always will be, Aboriginal land. Thank you. And before I hand it over, I'd just like to say I appreciate each and every one of you attending here today, the importance about addressing affordable housing and also social housing and the implications for each and every one of us. It's an important part of how we need to be able to share our resources rather than use the resources for self only, but to make sure that we create a community of people for all of us to be able to access real services and real housing. Because if we don't have an inclusion for each and every one of us, then we'll be excluded in ways, not just in the housing situation, but in so much more of our lives. So an important part of everyone being here today is how we can share those views, but also to be able to make a difference in moving forward. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy today's presentation, and let's continue to have the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne, for the introduction and beautiful country acknowledgements, like always. So, Cathy, if you want to introduce yourself, then we'll ask Julie and Lawrence to do the introduction, and then we'll come back to you with your presentation.
Thank you. And I am just going to try and share my screen. Okay. Let me find. Okay, so my name is, let me just get on to the slideshow. Can someone just confirm that they can see that?
Yes, we can see that. We can
Okay.
actually see the presenter view if you maybe you have double a screen, or maybe make it a single screen.
Let me see.
Maybe. Yes, this is perfect now.
That's great.
Thank you. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm calling in from Wongal land, which is adjacent to Gadigal, and I acknowledge leaders past and present, and particularly acknowledge Aboriginal people and leaders present today, especially you, Yvonne, and thank you for your always inspiring and generous welcome to country. I'm from Shelton, New South Wales, and just to tell you a bit about who we are, we've been around since 1975. We're essentially a lobby group, and but the people we lobby for are really for people in the lowest income brackets, people concerned with housing insecurity, and increasingly, because of the way the Australian housing system works, increasingly it's renters. So we've been around for quite a while out of our legacy Tenants Union, Homelessness New South Wales, and in our very early days we had our beginnings in the grassroots movements of green bands and quite activist groups like that. But in terms of and looking at the title of this session today, the future of Sydney, you know, we have a pretty clear view of what kind of Sydney we'd like to see, and we'd like to see a Sydney and New South Wales where everybody has access to affordable homes, accessible housing that's well located for employment and services, and well designed and well developed, so that people can live over their lifetimes in houses that are not too expensive to heat and easy to maintain. When we look at the broader city and New South Wales, why we want to see this is we think productive, affordable housing, accessible housing would lead to more productive cities and regions, poverty-free communities that support health and well-being. And we probably don't need any reminders today of in this pandemic that the impact of poor housing, overcrowded housing, really does impact on people's very directly impacts on people's health and well-being. So when we look at where do we advocate and what kinds of things, it's a whole range of things. It's a very complex system, the housing system, and I'm sure Dr. Lawson will elaborate further on just some of the complexities. There's a lot of different systems that overlap in terms of Commonwealth income support, finance, taxation. But for us, we lobby on all those things and advocate on all those things. But for us, it's we keep in mind the people at the centre of the system. Now, I could have put any number of headlines, if you looked at the papers, at academic articles, and any newspaper in the state, really, any regional newspaper over the last few months, you would have seen headlines like this. Now, this is just a snapshot from one website, Everybody's Home. It's a particular national campaign that we're part of, and that's just today's snapshot. And those headlines, pretty grim, but it gives you a flavour of just how frequently this issue is coming up. So it's come to a head, obviously in the last 18 months with the types of crisis in regional areas in particular that haven't been seen before. But we know that many of these issues have been around for a great many decades. And today I could have added another article. I saw a headline today from Per Capita, who's a think tank based out of Melbourne. And the headline was around a report they had, what the cost regarding the cost of buying a home, saying that it's over 2 decades, 2 generations, it's increased 130%. So that if you're aged between 41 or 56, you're worse off than the 2 generations before you. So that's just another headline, another report today. So it's there's no shortage of material to look at and to focus your mind on the housing system. Knowing what Dr. Lawson will cover, I wanted to just give you a few snapshots today, and I'll give you some headlines in the next couple of slides, and then just go back to some of the basics of particularly the social and affordable housing system, because it's it's often not understood. And at the end of this presentation, I'll be asking you to help us talk to your local representatives, state, federal and local. So it'd be worth probably just going back to some of the basics. So these are some snapshots from the Everybody's Home campaign site. I said it's a national program. You'll see these pop up on social media, but I think they do a really good job of just highlighting some of the cold, hard realities for sections of our community who, and some of these subsections represent hundreds and thousands of people. So there's a snapshot there about the almost 0% of rentals that are affordable for people living on the disability support pension. Similar stats around the percentage of rentals affordable for people, for single parents and the single parent payment. On the right-hand side, only 0.5% of rentals affordable for people retiring on the age pension. And then, you know, to the left there, I think quite a shocking reminder about the reality of lack of affordable housing for some people is, and this is a report that came out just a few weeks ago from Equity Economics, that close to 8,000 women are actually returning to perpetrators, and the sole reason is around not having access to housing, safe housing for them and their children. So these are quite grim, and I thought I'd put these up front rather than the end, just to really highlight for you. When we talk about the housing affordability issue in this country, these are the kinds of things we're talking about. And it's feels like a bit of a grim thing to add on a grim day, but it really does focus my mind when I think about why do I do this job and who are we advocating for. But just to show you a bit more, particularly in New South Wales, and the next slide's a little bit busy, but I'll give you a sense of what it's trying to show. This diagram is actually from a government website from Lancome, and it's quite a good description of how the housing sector works. So if you go from left to right, what it's showing there, in the middle bar there, the middle row, are the various income brackets. So I said that at Shelter we're primarily concerned for people in very low and low income brackets. It shows a selection of just what we would say are kind of key employment categories, some key workers there, and the types of salaries that those kinds of workers and various experience levels actually earn. And then at the very top, you'll see social housing is represented as the bar here, and affordable housing. So I'm mainly going to talk about social housing, but I will come back to this notion of affordable housing because it is a particular category, and because it has a very non-specific title, affordable housing, it's often confused with the general issue of affordability. So social housing, and I'll give you some breakdowns soon about what this looks like in New South Wales. Once upon a time, this would have been known as Housing Commission, public housing. Over time, the term social housing has emerged, and in the next slide, I'll show you the different groups of housing under that. But it's really housing that's run by the New South Wales government. Generally speaking, now it's a category of housing, people mainly on some kind of Commonwealth income support. It hasn't always been that way, and I'll tell you that about that history in a moment. So best known as public housing, and right around the state, there are various, sometimes very large estates of social housing estates that were built some time ago, but there is social housing right through our suburbs, towns and cities. This category in the middle, affordable housing, is a type of housing, so we would generally at Shelter call it affordable rental housing. So it's a form of subsidised rental housing. Most people would recognise it as community housing. So in Sydney, the city of Sydney, City West is a community housing provider that provides affordable housing. And usually it's the people who are eligible for that kind of housing are usually employed. They may not be employed full-time, but they're often employed, and they have a form of rent assistance from the Commonwealth that makes that a kind of rent subsidised product. Now, just pointing out one particular category here of worker, so nurses. So I thought it was just a good thing to remind you that while there's quite a number of categories, whether it's teachers or nurses, that once upon a time you would have thought, well, once you'd made it through university and you'd got a job, the Department of Education, in one of the hospitals, traditionally, you'd be on your way towards owning a home and certainly being able to manage rent. But it's increasingly the case that even people on what you'd call quite good jobs, reliable salaries, can easily rock up to banks with solid history behind them for asking for credit. It's simply unaffordable for these categories of people to own homes. And there was a report out just in the last few weeks talking about key workers from Ahuri, and just saying, for example, in the case of early career nurses, the conclusion of the report was there are no local government areas in the whole of Sydney, in Wollongong or Newcastle that have a median house price for sale that's affordable for an early career nurse. So nowhere. And only a few local government areas where even a kind of worker could afford to buy a unit. They also noted that across Sydney, there's 4,500 registered nurses and midwives living in overcrowded homes. So what we're seeing across Sydney are people being pushed further and further to the edges of the city, seeking affordable housing, certainly not buying it just to rent, and even commuting from places like Wollongong into jobs in the city. And another stat from this report was that in Sydney, there are 44,000 key workers who commute over 30 kilometres each day to get to work. And then there's a further 16,000 who are travelling over 50 k's. So when we start to think about what the lack of affordable housing means for our city, you can really just think about what that means for people's lives, for their pocket in terms of tolls, and just for their well-being in terms of hours spent commuting. And a reminder that a lot of you're talking ambulance officers, if you're talking nurses, a lot of them are working rosters on social hours, so it's a really quite a heavy toll that people are paying in terms of their lives. So we won't talk a lot today about this affordable rental housing product, but I think you can't talk about social housing without talking about it, because what we're seeing increasingly are thousands of people who don't qualify for social housing, mainly because it's rationed, but who are struggling, who end up being poor renters. And I heard a story just the last week about the police academy in Goulburn, about the concerns they have about the hundreds of young constables who come out of the academy assigned to the inner city and inner suburbs of Sydney. They simply cannot afford to rent in the city, and so they're finding a lot of them, same with paramedics, living in cars or dossing down in very overcrowded dwellings to try and be somewhere close to work and not be turning over their whole pay packet to rent. So that's just a picture of the system. I mentioned I'd tell you a bit of the story. Now this slide comes from the Land and Housing Corporation, and I think it's just a good reminder that once upon a time social housing was quite a well-known thing. I think of where I grew up in Maitland and Hunter Valley. I look back now, I think a lot of my friends did live in what was called back then Housing Commission, or a lot of my friends lived in defence housing as well. But it was just the way suburbs were built. There were lots and lots of people living in this kind of social housing, particularly in the 50s, post-World War II. Government saw that it was their responsibility to help working people have a decent life and have a roof over their head. And there was a big focus in those early decades around helping people move into home ownership. And then over time, as the LAC strategy pointed out, it has become quite a different product. And because there's so little of it, and I'll cover a little bit about that soon, it's become rationed and And really, if you look around, there's a wait list of over 50,000 applications across New South Wales. There's a priority, the most urgent list is well over 5,000. Because of the lack of stock, it's really, what little social housing there is really reserved for what you can see there is regarded as safety net housing. So that's kind of the tale you'll hear from anyone who talks about social housing in New South Wales. And just for a snapshot, and I'm going through all the different departments here, but here's a different slide, a different department, the Department of Communities and Justice. This is their data from June last year, just to show you how the social housing stock is made up. So you can see there over 96,000, what's traditionally known as public housing. In the middle, there is the Aboriginal Housing Office, has a stock with other community housing organisations managing that Aboriginal housing on their behalf. And then to the right, over 45,000 dwellings managed on behalf of the government by the community housing sector. So it's a lot of dwellings when you look at those numbers, but the key message to take away is those, and the government is certainly building properties, there's no doubt about that, but what we're finding is it's simply not keeping up. And that was, and that's the conclusion from Professor Pawson from University of New South Wales City Futures. He talks a lot about the degree to which governments are doing, they are building things, but it's simply not keeping up with population growth, and it's certainly not keeping up with demand. And so if you see in New South Wales, yes, there's been more dwellings built, but when you actually look at the growth in the stock versus how the population has grown, it's simply not keeping up. And that's a really big problem right across the city and the state. So from Shelter New South Wales' point of view, when we think about what do we need, and this is, if anyone asks, so what do we need, we would just say this, and so would Homelessness New South Wales, so would NCOS, so would Community Housing Association. To simply bridge that gap and catch up, we need to build or acquire, they don't all have to be built, 5,000 additional units of social housing each year for a decade just to catch up. We need some really solid investment into the maintenance program because a lot of the stock is old. It needs to be repaired and brought up to standards, particularly around energy efficiency, particularly for disability access. Meanwhile, the homeless, the number of people who are already homeless and becoming homeless is surging. That's not going away. So we absolutely need to support the homeless, the specialist homeless sector, who do an incredible job supporting people, particularly in light of the fact that they don't have enough, there's not enough homes for them to place people. It would be great if we could stop people becoming homeless. So we would say that tenancy reform is really critical. New South Wales, there's landlords have quite a lot of power under the no grounds eviction powers. So we're really concerned, and we really need to ensure that tenants have a better deal. There's a lot that could be done to support people in those low incomes to maintain their tenancies in the private market. So we'd like to see more of that. And we acknowledge that the New South Wales government it did last year, and it's produced a better program this round of the outbreak, a genuine hardship fund. And we would predict that in the months ahead, we will see rental deferrals, we will see homelessness rise as people are evicted for not paying rent. But just to show you, like, this is not pipe dreams, here's just an interesting graph here to show that all of these things are choices, and government over history has made various policy choices and commitments. And you can see back during the GFC, there was a concerted effort federally and at the state level for the state to get much more involved in constructing. So it is possible, and it has been done, and it's done certainly around in a much bigger way in countries around the world. One other thing we'd like to see, if we think about the future of Sydney, Sydney is growing. The government is actively planning for what it would say is a new city to the west in the Western Parkland City. Our great plea from Shelter New South Wales is to really challenge the notion that if you build a new city, open up new land and allow the private sector to build homes, we challenge the notion, and this is based on research, that the private sector will necessarily produce enough well-built, well-located, low-cost housing for the hundreds of thousands of low-income and ordinary income people who are expected to live and work there. And a good example of that is the new Aerotropolis, so the new city that will be built around the new airport. We were delighted to see the New South Wales government really actively planning about what type of infrastructure would be needed to support that city. Lots of great planning for the roads, the sewerage. These are all really critical things, but we were quite dismayed, I think, to see that the need and the demand for social housing and affordable rental housing was excluded from the infrastructure planning. And as an example, the assumption would be that any additional social housing would really only come from redeveloping estates that exist in some of the local council areas around it. And we could see as little as 200 additional social dwellings being developed there over the next 20 years, which, if you just think about life and what happens in people's lives, it just seems ridiculous that we wouldn't think that a new city is absolutely going to require more than 200 additional social housing dwellings. And we know for the great mass of workers who will flock to that city, and they'll flock there if it's well built and well designed, people will flock there. And if we don't have enough affordable rental housing, that is that subsidised rental housing, then we will see people in the lower incomes, fighting it out for what little low-cost housing there is out there.
So, Cathy, just for the sake of time, I wasn't sure how do you have the?
This is the last one.
Oh,
so,
cool, excellent.
So what you can do, I'm sure this attendee list is above average intelligence. I can just tell, and you're interested because you're here on a Friday afternoon listening to this. So, and if you vote, you have some power. And the cold, hard truth is a lot of politicians from all stripes think that people do not care about social housing, in fact, that it's the vote killer. So if you want to see more action on this, you really need to let your local representatives know. They think people don't care about it. They think that it's something that they shouldn't campaign on. So if you think they should, please tell them. And particularly leading up to local council elections, wherever you are, go check out your council's housing plans. They will most likely have a local housing strategy. Check it out, read it, and hold them to account. Ask them what they're doing. There's a lot of commitments, but see if there's some action. And lastly, an ad for me, certainly come and join us and help us advocate and lobby. The more people we have and the more organisations we have on board, the greater is our voice when we talk to government, local, state and federal. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Cathy. Cathy, very comprehensively set the scene and pictured what's going on in New South Wales and Sydney. I mean, I had some slides I wanted to show, but again, when I saw your slide, I said this is much comprehensive than what I could present. So if everyone's happy, let's keep the questions till the end. I think we have Julie on call. So Julie, I leave the introduction to you so you can introduce yourself. And I think I made you co-host already. Yes, so you can also share your screen and introduce yourself. Just to give everyone's a note that Julie is actually based in Netherlands and she's calling from Europe now. So it's very early in the morning there. So thank you very much for doing that for us.
Thanks, Mead, and also thank you, Yvonne, for asking me to be involved today. Yes, I'm based in the Netherlands and have been for quite some years, but certainly my head and heart is often in Australia, and most of my research, in fact, is dedicated towards improving housing outcomes for people in Australia. So just to give you a bit of a background, since my early days as a researcher, I was actually working at the City of Melbourne. At that time, there had been if you like, a financial crisis, and yes, another one. And many of the buildings, in fact, were, some of the buildings were becoming what they call empty or delinquent at the time. And there was an effort to bring people back to live in the city, and a program to demonstrate how that could happen, to utilise underutilised land for housing, to try to look at planning measures that could improve opportunities, but also to work out ways in which all opportunities could include those people who live already or on the edge of the city, who have a low income, etc. And in those early days in '93, I took myself off overseas and went to visit 12 cities in different parts of the world, and looked at a whole range of programs at that time, about 22 different programs, looking at all kinds of measures that cities can take a lead on and can try to make a difference. And here I am almost 25 years later, and we're just finishing something called the Housing 2030 report, which is for the United Nations. And that report is on all the policy tools in land policy, in channeling finance and investment towards affordable housing, in better standards for adequate housing in terms of energy efficiency, but also quality, dealing with overcrowding, those things. And also around the governance and regulation of those who provide affordable housing to vulnerable groups in particular. It's very important that they be well regulated and that they utilise whatever public support that we provide for them in an effective and transparent way to generate good tenant outcomes and to ensure continuing growth and supply of that dedicated social and affordable housing. So in October this year, that report will be adopted by 56 countries. That the ministers of those countries will meet in Geneva, and I'll present that report and discuss it, also an action plan related to it with them. So I just wanted to basically now move on to highlight some particular issues, I think, which beset the Australian social housing sector. So I'll just try and share my screen with you and find the right.
Sure. And if you can also stick to maybe, I mean, it's 3:35 here, so maybe between 10 to 15 minutes. I know it's short, but I really want to have that discussion at the end. So I'm sure many of these things will come up again. So thank you for that.
Does that begin?
Yes, it's excellent.
All right. Okay. So I want to draw attention to the fact that you know, when we're talking about social housing, one of the largest players in that social housing system is public housing. It's often overlooked. It's possibly the ugly duckling, but once it was the motor of social housing provision. Some would say it's now become, if you like, the milk cow also. So these are fairly bombastic terms, but it's important to see that public housing fits within a broader social housing system, and it is large, and it hasn't been the subject of 30 years of love and attention. So during that time, it's seen its funding for capital investment decline, a very narrowing revenue base, constrained in terms of its rent policy, constrained in terms of its operating subsidies. there's a severe, especially in New South Wales, backlog in maintenance. It has very limited capacity to expand because it's not able to access some of the more favourable financing arrangements. In fact, it's not eligible even to access NIFIC funding. There are varying strategies around trying to garner investment and renew and address. Many of those involve the redevelopment of existing assets, certainly not the acquisition of new assets. While it is a dominant player, it has been weak politically. It's not the favoured player in the social housing system, and therefore, in part, it's been subject to highly extractive practices of its assets, involving not just transfers, but sales, demolitions, densification, and in part privatisation. There have been many reports by researchers over the years trying to argue that public housing should have greater recognition for the service it provides. In providing that service, it needs to be properly costed and funded. There needs to be much more professionalism in the maintenance strategies and in their long-term plans. You see Auditor Generals over successive years complaining that the level of public administration dedicated to maintenance and improvement has been very poor. And underlying that is also a lack of revolved reinvestment in special purpose long-term funding for maintenance and redevelopment, if you like, a replacement strategy, and not just that, an acquisition strategy to grow. Some public housing authorities don't even have an acquisition strategy. They don't even have a future plan. And so we should be asking them, why not? And, what is it about your circumstances that you are not doing this? Also, there have been demands on, of course, a shift from public to private financing. We all know that private financing is more expensive and that public borrowing costs can be significantly lower and also can be used more strategically. We've looked at that in great detail with Laurence Troy and Ryan van der Nulon from University of New South Wales, and costed that it is in fact about 24% less expensive to do things more directly through strategic public investment than to rely on private financing initiatives and so on. There's also been recommendations to broaden the tenant income profile. In fact, that may be a mechanism to also broaden the size of the sector, reduce its stigmatisation. There's certainly a need out there to broaden it. We know that most people who in fact are eligible for public housing reside in the private rental sector, where they're subject to significantly more rents, which of course are market-based, and they are much more likely to be in housing stress than tenants in public housing. So we know about the story of the decline, and you can see public housing, the grey. You can see community housing, the light grey, and you can see how combined over time it's been declining. So what we've been doing over the last 30 years in terms of, if you like, a revolution in the way in which we provide and finance social housing has actually, we've seen it decline and not increase. And that's a similar story that can be found in the United Kingdom, for example, where we often take a lot of leadership from, which has lost almost 1 million of its 5 million council homes, and that the proportion also has fallen in terms of population, a point that Hal Pawson's been making for Australia too. So my point is, what do we want public housing to be? And I would say love your public housing and work out what role you wish it to play. Think about what its future should be. Do you want it to be an underfunded, poorly managed, with little vision, as I mentioned, deteriorating, politically unsupported? Or do you want it to be a well-funded, professionally managed, with a strong vision, productive, well-connected, and a community ally? There are choices and examples around the world of the latter. And for example, even in the United States, you see the many public housing authorities there becoming quite innovative. Some would say like a not-profit, and building alliances with local communities, having representation on their boards, building partnerships with services in their local areas. We should expect that from public housing. Perhaps it's too big. Maybe it should be broken up into smaller community-based entities, public entities, for example, that have more tenant representation on their boards, more local representation from local government, more partnership involved from key stakeholders and service providers who give it a stronger sense of focus in local community. Yes, that can be reformed. Perhaps we should be thinking about that. We've also seen that we're getting, I'll move on a bit more fast, I think, because at the moment we're going through a big review of regulation of the social housing sector. And part of that discussion involves who should be regulated, should public housing be part of that, should for-profit providers be involved, who should regulate the affordable dwellings that are provided by the for-profit or affordable housing provider. How should we regulate them? Because at the moment they're partly outside. Also, in thinking about post-COVID responses, are we going to go back to business as usual? International advice is very much pushing towards greater focus on social inclusion, also of low carbon and energy efficiency in terms of the circular economy, and social housing can, of course, play a key role in innovation, in experimentation, in piloting new building processes, and also in models of management and tenant involvement and in engagement. But to some degree, we need to also change the conversation around public housing from, we see often in the media, one of crises. Perhaps we should be talking about how it was considered in the past and not so recent past in responding to crises. For example, in 1983, Australian governments were producing around 14,000 dwellings a year. We're now producing a handful, a pitiful number of dwellings. So, you know, why is it that we don't do that now? Why don't we see the social housing system as a structural solution to the affordability problem, like they do in some countries like Austria, which sees the production, the stability provided by an effective and broad social housing system in playing a role in the stability of the construction sector and employment as well. Why do we see a reliance on private concession-based leaseback and private financing models, which involve significant ongoing subsidy to financiers of housing? We see less direct investment, which is actually more effective in ensuring tenant outcomes than in the other, which often require much deeper income-related subsidies, or which, of course, at the end of the day, do not produce additional dwellings and so on. This is how we saw public housing playing a role in the past. As I mentioned, in post-World War II reconstruction and social housing stability programs, in dealing with recessions, in building back better cities, in the social housing initiative, which itself was largely a grant-funded exercise. How do we value public housing? We should be arguing not so much around it being a burden and being a cost, but seeing it as an investment in security, in social justice, in shaping better markets, in avoiding costs of homelessness and inadequate housing, and not in marginalising public housing to simply be an ambulance for market failure, but seeing it much more in terms of being a contribution to shaping better, more socially just markets. So social housing investment is essential. We've done research to show that there is a backlog and a need over the next 30 years, 20 years for 727,000 dwellings. A huge proportion of those are in New South Wales and Victoria, over half, and 20% in Sydney. We've modelled the different funding and financing mix and found that strategic upfront public investment in the form of either land or in grant, and coupled with long-term low-cost, at best public financing, or secondly NEFIC financing, is the most cost-effective, providing, as I said, 24% savings over the operating and subsidy models provided by PPPs and PFI models. Here's some statistics on those needs. One last comment on regulation. Who should we be regulating? Everybody that is responsible for housing low-income and vulnerable tenants in particular should be regulated. All those providers of housing should be regulated. Anyone who's receiving a public subsidy should be regulated. These are clearly important requirements of good public policy in the public interest. I would watch the Victorian review. It's coming out with some really good consultation discussion papers on this issue. And in addressing the regulatory challenges, some are saying that we should be seeing them from a human rights perspective, about how do these entities help to realise the right to adequate housing for all, or deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. That all providers should have affordable and social housing provision as their core mission, not as a side business. That public housing subsidies need a clear purpose, and it should be transparent and also sustained over time. We shouldn't be robbing Peter to pay Paul. So in effect, extracting from public housing to pay for social housing growth. We'd looked at NRAS and tax credits and how they need to be, if you like, compliant, and also consider their cost effectiveness over time, because they are expensive, in fact, even though they're not so explicit on the public budget. Also that these novel forms of legal entities, community interest companies, all kinds of other subsidiaries and so on, can create regulatory difficulties because they are difficult to trace. They're not subject to the same auditing and accounting and regulatory exposure. So best avoided. There are examples of why in England and so on. So I mainly want to just end with land policy. As Yvonne would know, land is power. Having displaced and land stolen has removed power. And that's the way in which we should see land policy. Land policy is something which embodies the ethics and ideals of your community. So local government, city governments like Sydney, can play an incredibly important leadership, if you like, norm shaping role as to how we consider land and how we see it in terms of meeting our obligations to our fellow citizens. So just to draw your attention to one particular report we did last year, which I'm quite proud of because it's very tangible and provides many illustrations of useful practical examples. There's also recognition for Indigenous-based planning and also ideas around reconciliation and recognition in planning and the way in which we should be thinking about that. So that particular report has many ideas about public land banking. There was some mention by Cathy of Landcom. What should we be expecting Landcom to be doing? Let's have a look at some international best practices on the role of public land bankers in this process. For example, in Vienna, public land leasing. We don't always have to give away our land. We can also lease that land. Land readjustment. Cathy gave a great example of what's going on out there by the new airport. What are we getting back in terms of social return on investment? Land value recapture, mechanisms to do that, of course, are very good when there are development pressures on existing land. Regulative planning, look at cities like Vienna or Helsinki as very good examples where they have clear land use zones now for particular segments of the housing market. I'm living in the Netherlands where 30% of all dwellings on private land have to be social housing. In Vienna, there are specific zones to ensure that that is what is produced there by anybody. They can produce social housing so long as they do it in a limited profit, decent standard way on a cost rent basis. Also comprehensive neighbourhood planning. So working together between on transport issues, on neighbourhood development and on social inclusion to ensure that social housing is part of that. Just one example, and that's the last slide, which is how have they done it practically in Scotland recently. They've come to the end of a very successful housing strategy there where they produced almost 50,000 dwellings in a short period of time, of which 70% of them are social housing. And that partnership between local government and if you like, the Scottish government in working out needs-based investment plans for local areas was very effective in getting agreements on the ground for what type of units needed to be developed and getting the money to ensure that that was possible. So have a look again, that comes from that report on local land policies. Scotland's powered on to produce an even better housing strategy now for 2040 with ambitions for 100,000 affordable units in a short space of time. So it can be done. It's not pipe dreams. It takes political will and people like Yvonne to show great leadership. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. That was amazing. I mean, very insightful. Great to see how other countries are actually trying to tackle this issue. And as you said, I think it really needs a strong political will behind it to change the way it's going. I mean, we have Laurence on the panel. I mean, sorry, Laurence, we've been very deep into some of these the beautiful presentations that Julie and Cathy did. So do you mind introducing yourself? And I know a lot of areas are covered already by Julie's and Cathy's presentation, but if there is any specific thing you want to comment on, because you are in Sydney, you're at University of Sydney, and I think you might have some very local comments that you could add to some of these problems that were discussed.
Thanks for the introduction. So maybe I'll quickly introduce myself. I am, yes, at the University of Sydney. I'm a lecturer in urbanism, and I worked with Julie on one of the reports that she was just presenting on, particularly around the housing need aspects and the costs. There's one part of that I wanted to point out. If you if you line up the need and you project it forward over a number of years, because we can't deliver all in one go, it would be like saying 22% or just over 22% of all housing we build for 20 years would need to be social housing to meet that backlog. And if you want to add in some affordable housing, going back to Cathy's conversation about the different sort of groupings, another 12%. So it's like saying a third of all new housing development for 20 years would have to be social or affordable housing. Now that just sort of illustrates the scale of the challenge if you wanted to deliver housing based on some idea of need, but it also illustrates that we actually need to think about the housing system in totality and how it delivers housing generally. So we have basically all new housing delivered through for-profit development model. And I would suggest that we need to think about the role of for-profits in that, in the totality, and also the role of not-for-profits in delivering new housing going forward. And we need to have a much expanded space for them to be actors. So a corollary of that is saying, well, it will be in locations like inner city, Sydney. We're not building public housing estates on the fringe anymore, and we do not want to build vast public housing estates on the fringe in the same way we've done in the past. So that means we need to implicate the planning system in a very deep way, which is sort of what Julie was also partly talking about right at the end there. So we need to be in conversation with, you know, City of Sydney, Landcom, these kinds of agencies, and land is a kind of central part of all of that. So I have lots to say, but maybe you want to open it up a bit.
No, that was great, Laurence. Thank you. I think I saw Ian is also on the call. Ian, do you want to, Ian, if you want to unmute yourself and introduce yourself as well, and if you want to have another comment on top of all the comments that we've had, that would be great.
Sure. So I represent the Australian Housing Initiative. What we specialise in is looking at data and advising councils and governments around the country for different type of housing and policies that will actually make a difference immediately. We're not talking 3, 4, 5 years, because as we know, the social housing is not being built and we need more money put towards that, but it's not a quick fix. So what we've done is done the research into the amount of people that are actually looking for accommodation that are on the housing waiting list, and basically 60 to 80% of the housing waiting list is a single and couple makeup, so a 1 or 2 person household. What we specialise in is being able to put policy in place, which there are policies all over the country, to take the existing housing stock, convert them into micro apartments, which effectively gives everyone their own bathroom, their own sitting room, their own bedroom and their own kitchenette, and they share one communal area in the house. And effectively, you know, we could produce within 6 months, you could probably produce 10,000 new homes off the existing housing stock of mum and dad investors, at an affordable rate for people to rent. They basically save 1/3 to 1/2 off their normal weekly rent. And for me, this is a stopgap to be able to take on for the government then to say, we know we need more social housing. Everyone on this page, on this call, is pushing for that. But effectively, this is going to sound ridiculous. We're using mum and dad investors that are pushing housing prices in an upward direction to create more housing, which means if we can actually fix the supply and demand issue that's in the market right now, we then will have at least a stagnation in house prices so that people can actually buy their own home again, which in Australia, the greatest Australian dream is to buy a house, but that's just unaffordable. And I suppose without going into too much detail, that's the overall umbrella picture of how we'll try and work and want more people to work towards.
Thank you very much, Ian. Yvonne, do you want to add something else before, because we're almost finished with time? I mean, I wish I had a 2-hour session. I didn't know it's going to go that well. But Yvonne, if you want to make another final comment, and I'm sure if there are any questions, you can send it to me. I can send it to Cathy and Julie and Laurence if there's any question, or you can directly contact them, but don't bombard them with emails, please. But Yvonne, floor is yours if you want to make a last comment.
Look, I don't really have much, I don't want to hold everyone up, but I mean, for me, it's, you know, there's so many issues that we've covered in such a short space of time, but I think those issues are so important for each and every one of us to be able to take on. Certainly, in terms of my team in running in the council elections, about looking at how we can truly make the difference in looking at social and affordable housing, that it isn't about one end of town actually doing what they think and not doing it, including everyone and every part of our society to be able to access real and true affordable housing. And the social housing space shouldn't be at the expense, shouldn't be held at ransom really in terms of how other developments taking place. You know, there are a range of commitments, but I think the reality of how those commitments are being implemented needs to be looked at a lot closer. And certainly the team that that I have working with me is actually looking at that. But there is so much more that each and every one of all of us that are online here today can make that difference. So whether that be utilising your expertise and supporting my team, or even using your vote in a particular way that can make sure that this change is happening for the people and with the people. So I don't really have much else to say. I'm not sure if the team members would like to contribute, but it's been such an important event and we need to have more of it. And so I appreciate everyone's time here today and the effort that's been put into the presentations, but also the issues that have been covered today. There's so much more that we need to do, and I appreciate your time here today. So not sure if anyone else would like to say anything. So
thank you very much, Yvonne. Just for the sake of time, it's Friday afternoon, and I don't want to hold anyone here, but let's stay in touch, just like what we've done today. I mean, Cathy, Julie, Lawrence, that was great. Ian, great comments. And thank you very much, everybody. This session was recorded, so you'll have a copy of the recording online later if you want to send it to colleagues or other people who might want to learn more about the social housing issues that we have in Sydney and in general in Australia, actually. So thank you very much. Have a great afternoon and weekend. Stay home weekend, and hopefully to see you in another virtual think tank series session. Thank you, everyone.